Hello everyone, here is a video on how not to fail almost any class. And this is specifically if your teachers are really not good at teaching. I'm making a few assumptions. First of all, this is specifically for STEM classes. It does apply to other classes too, but not so much because other classes are kind of formatted completely differently. Also assuming that your teacher is really not a good teacher and that your teacher allows you to use electronics in class. I do want to say that not all teachers are terrible. I've had plenty of great ones, and I don't want to discredit that, but a lot of them, especially as you get into upper division classes, they're experts in their field, and they are not experts at teaching. So they're going to be expecting you to know a lot of things that they know that you won't necessarily know because you're a student, not an expert. I also want to say that you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have taken AP classes in high school to get good grades. You really just have to be strategic and you have to be willing to put in the effort. So I don't want you blaming your teachers for your bad grade, which sometimes that is valid, and there's definitely times when you get a bad grade because of a bad teacher, but at the same time, you're responsible for putting in the work, and so you can't just blame the teacher all the time. So here are all of the tips that I will be going through if you want to screenshot them for reference later, but I'll be going through them one by one. So the first one is put in as much effort as you can at the beginning of the semester. And this is really important because you don't know, especially if you're like a freshman, you don't know how hard the class is going to be. So really putting in your best foot forward is going to help you gauge to see how hard the class is. If you need to put in more effort for further modules, if you need to, if you study too much, you can kind of pull back. It's really just a good idea to put in your best effort and kind of go from there to see how hard you need to work. Also, especially for STEM classes, a lot of them, not always, but most of the time, they do get progressively harder. So if you have a good grade for like the first 2-3 units, that will really help protect your grade as you get later on to, unit 4, unit 5, final exam. Also, the material often builds off of previous knowledge. So if you're in unit 3, you don't know something from unit 1, you're going to have to go back and relearn it. That's going to be a lot more work on yourself. Also, I would say the majority of STEM finals are cumulative. So not that you have to be reviewing everything constantly, but if you have a good, at least understanding of the concepts from the earlier modules, it'll definitely make it a lot easier to understand it later on when you have to in the final. Lastly, you're going to get more burned out as the semester goes on. This is just personal experience. I think all college students have this. You just get more overwhelmed, less motivated. It's cold, you have a lot of work, and it just kind of piles up at the end. Again, it's just really good to have solid grades for your first few tests so that you have some wiggle room to make mistakes later on in the semester. Here's a graph I made of the progression of the semester. So level, difficulty of material, it's college, it's STEM, we start out pretty hard. And yes, it's likely going to get harder. But your motivation at the start is going to be much higher than later on at the semester. Yes, there will be a plummet after you come back for Thanksgiving break. So what I really want you to do is focus on your time before that, September, October, as much of November even as you can. And that's when I really want you to maximize your study habits and just do as well as you can at the start. So the second tip is to do your homework. And I know homework it's very boring, very, very time consuming. And a lot of the times, I'll talk more about this later, but a lot of the times you won't even be tested on the things that you had to do in homework. But usually, another tip really quick is just to look at the grade weight. And, homework, it'll usually be like 5 to 10 points usually, and that may not look like a lot, but it can really help you from going from an A to a B, or if you're on the cusp of a C, it can really help lift your grade up. So it's really important to actually do your homework, even if you don't feel like you're learning from it, even if you don't think it really benefits you. Really try to aim for like a 85 plus, like more if you can, because a lot of the times it's open book, and you can do multiple attempts. And so yes, it's going to take a lot of time and it's really boring, but it'll help your grade in the long run. And this is also for like other assignments like presentations and projects. And those, it kind of depends on the class, but a lot of the times presentations and projects, they're not really graded as hard as you might think. And a lot of the times they're just there to give you a boost in your grade. And so they're really graded on completion. Again, depends on the class, depends on the teacher, but this has just been my experience. So like I was saying earlier, homework, you're probably not going to see it again on the test. This has been my experience. I can't say this 100% of the time for wherever you're at, but I would say the majority of times you're not really going to see the homework problems on a test. Usually the homework is like way more difficult and just kind of confusing. So if you want to study, I would recommend looking at the practice problems that, the teacher, if they give you practice problems, or if there's tutoring available, or, looking at old quiz questions, that's a really good way to study, or office hours. So those are how I would study for a test. And yeah, so don't see homework as studying, basically. Just see it as free points. Another really important thing is to go to class. And this may sound kind of, you don't want to go to class, you're in college now, you have more freedom. But if attendance or participation is part of your grade, then you're literally getting free points just to sit in the back of class and online shop or watch football. Okay, you don't necessarily even have to pay attention. Just sitting in the class and getting your name written down for attendance, that can get you extra points if it is part of the grade. A lot of colleges also have, attendance policy rules, so you really want to make sure you're following that so you don't get dropped from the class. And some other reasons to go to class is a lot of the times the professor will tell you like, oh, make sure you pay attention to this topic, or oh, make sure you know this for the test. So that can be really helpful. And if it's a small class, they might recognize you and see, like, oh, hey, this person's coming to my class, and they can even help, grade you more leniently. So the key takeaway from this, I don't want to say no skill, because they do require a lot of effort, but the easier things that count towards your grade. So again, attendance, homework, projects, presentations, the things that are kind of graded on completion, or that are given like multiple attempts. So do these assignments and they'll really help boost your grade. These assignments, they're not really going to help you do better on the test, most likely. You're still going to have to put in studying outside of these assignments, but they're really going to help your overall grade, which will give you some more room if you don't do as well on a test. They may seem really boring, really stupid, but they are going to help your grade a lot if you actually take the time and do them. Okay, my next tip. You got to know when to pay attention and when to zone out in your class. So, if your teacher is bad, then you kind of can zone out a lot of the times, I'm being honest. So I'm going to start with the zone out first, when you can zone out. If the teacher goes on a personal rant or story, you don't have to pay attention to that. Most of the times it's not really related to anything. And if the teacher is lecturing word for word from the slides, you can zone out. If the slideshow is published on, your Canvas or your Blackboard, your Schoology, wherever, if you have the slides available to you, then you don't really need to be paying attention to your teacher during class. So if you're in a biology class and they teach you like a math equation or something like that, in my experience, I was never tested on like math in a biology class. So I would usually zone out because you're never, in my experience, you're never going to see it on the test. And for chem, math, physics, that kind of thing, you're probably not going to be tested on the history. You're probably going to be tested on calculations. So a lot of the times they like to be like, oh, like Pasteur, Newton, blah, blah, blah. They don't actually test you on that unless they say specifically. Again, this has just been my experience. I'm sure every school is different, but that's just what I found. Okay, when to actually pay attention. So I know this may sound kind of counterintuitive, but you should at least try to pay attention at first. Again, I mean like the first few units, you want to try to pay attention and see, does the teacher actually help me get a better grade, or am I going to be teaching myself? So this is just something you're going to be seeing as you go through like the first half of your semester. And then yes, so if the slides are not posted, you really do have to pay attention, especially if I don't recommend buying the textbook. A lot of places don't really make you unless it's part of the homework. So if you're not, you don't have a textbook, you don't have slides, all you have is the lectures. Even if the teacher is bad, then that's kind of when you do have to pay attention. This one's obvious. In chem, math classes, physics, you got to pay attention for the calculations. Again, you got to pay attention if the teacher says like, hey, this is important. Okay, next tip. So we talked about when you can and can't zone out. So for the times when you can zone out, it's really important to use your zone out time wisely. So how do you view your zone out time? You can, goof off, do whatever you want, or you can see it as a study hall. So again, I have it up here, bad teacher plus mandatory attendance equals zone out or study hall. If you want to zone out, totally fine. I wouldn't blame you. But it can also be really helpful to use these hours. Most classes are 1 or 2 hours at least. It can be really helpful to use that as a study hall. Again, I'm assuming your teacher lets you use a laptop in class. And if that is the case, that is a perfect opportunity to do your homework in class. Study in class. Do whatever you need to. And the way I see it is, you're in class. It's going to be boring. Whether you're watching football, online shopping, it's going to be boring. Or whether you're doing your homework. How I kind of see it is, at least I don't have to be bored in class and then still have to study later. At least I can just be bored and do my homework in class. That way later I have less to do, hopefully. Sometimes skipping class is in your benefit. So when this is the case is if your teacher is bad and if there is no attendance policy. Okay? And I want to be clear again, for these tips 5 and 6, you won't know this until like halfway through the semester or at least like a month in. So I don't want you to just be skipping class like week 2. This is something that you need to kind of see for yourself. Like, am I benefiting from this? And you're going to have to see it as the semester goes on. So if you feel like you've been teaching yourself the material and you can, learn faster, do your homework quicker, outside of class, then I wouldn't say there's a reason that you need to go to class. I skip class a lot if I feel like I'm not learning anything and if I feel like I can learn more outside of class. Just as long as you're making sure you're keeping up with the attendance policy, if there is one at your school. And a really important one is making sure you're still turning in the assignments and watching for any schedule changes, because sometimes those happen. Anything like pop quizzes, anything like that. As long as you're not missing anything like that, as long as there's no attendance policy, like for your grade, as long as it doesn't count for your grade, then honestly, I would not recommend going to a class. Again, this is just, I've kind of already said all this, but this is just an overview of everything I said. So here are your options: going to class or skipping class. You can either pay attention or study hall, this is best for if your teacher is good. So if you have a good teacher, I really, really recommend paying attention and taking notes. This is very important. We're going to be talking about this in a minute. Okay, so a little bit more about note taking. So a lot of the times, right before a test, usually like a week before, sometimes a few days before, the teacher is going to drop a study guide. And this study guide is probably going to be like 5 pages long at least. And it's just going to be a list of everything that they want you to know before the exam. And in my experience, this has been literally every single topic that they've covered in the entire unit. So as far as like narrowing things down, it doesn't really narrow anything down. So what I do is just I take my own notes as I go along. That way I'm kind of, at least familiar with the material, and that way it won't like all pile up at the end. And your notes, they're really going to be your study guide for the test. And oh yeah, I have this in red here. Even if you haven't been attending, make sure you're keeping up with the course material. So what that means, don't wait for the day before the test. That's kind of setting yourself up for failure. You kind of just keep at the same pace as the class. And then for if your teacher doesn't give you study guides, you just kind of got to assume everything's important and then kind of filter it down as you go from there. It's kind of hard to know what's going to be tested and what's not. So I like to just assume that anything could be testable and kind of go from there. So that's why it's really important for me to like keep up with the same pace as the class and not just cram it all at once. Okay, next one. This is a very important one. You're going to have to get used to teaching yourself or seeking out help from other people if your teacher is really that bad. Some resources are, tutoring. Sometimes they have this at your university. I've been to group tutoring and individual tutoring. They're both very helpful for me. Or you can look for sources online, YouTube, Google, whatever. Books. Don't really recommend that one, but you get my point. You just have to find what works for you. And just remember that you're the one who's going to have to put in the work. You're responsible for how you perform in the class. To an extent, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But even if the teacher is bad, there's still a good chance you can do well. And you just got to teach yourself and, find others who can help you and, make the most of your resources. Okay. Next one. If your teacher tests things that they never taught you, and this is very common, actually, unfortunately, then I like to look desperate. I call this the 3 stages of desperation. So if you did really bad on a test that you studied everything for, you learned all the material, and there was just these questions that you never saw coming, never were taught them, never saw them anywhere, then what you have to do is just look like you're trying hard. So go to class, sit in the front, pay attention. Even if you're not paying attention, just pretend to. Just be there and have the teacher know who you are, know your name, know that you're trying. And then if you're really desperate, you can even ask and answer questions in class. And if you're like super desperate, office hours. Office hours, they're awkward, they're kind of weird, but going to office hours can really help show that you care and that you're trying. So if you don't know what to ask them in office hours or you think it's going to be awkward, a good thing to do is always ask like, hey, can we go over the test together and see like which questions I missed? That's always a good bet. Okay, some real quick bonus tips before we get to our last one. For lab class, sit with the smart kids if you know who they are. This is really important. Labs are super confusing. I struggle in labs. I think most people do. So if you know who the smart kids are, try and sit with them. I guarantee it will help you a lot. Next, put your big assignments, things that are worth like 10, 15% of the grade or more. Put that in your calendar. Final exams, they're often going to be at different days and times than your regular class meetings. Also, do not buy textbooks. most of the times, unless you're using them for homework, you're not really going to be using your textbooks. And then if you do need a book, try and find it at the library or try finding a PDF online. Okay, last two. Submitting anything is better than submitting nothing. Even if it's done poorly and you started at last minute, it's not your best work, even if you submit that and get like a 30 or 40, that's still better than getting a 0. Same in the same vein with AI. If a teacher catches you for AIing a paper, that's going to be a 0. So submitting something poorly done is still going to be better than submitting an AI thing that's going to be flagged and then you're going to get a 0 for that. My last tip is just to trick yourself into thinking that you're a genius just while you're studying. I know a lot of the time it's really easy to get overwhelmed if you're confused, you get frustrated with yourself. And I would say just take a pause, slow it down, just break everything into steps and focus on just one thing at a time. It's okay if you don't get it immediately. I don't think really nobody really does, but just kind of slow down, give yourself time to make mistakes, and that's totally fine. Remember, this whole video has been about getting good grades, but as you can see, it's not really a measure of intelligence. It's really just about being strategic and putting in work. And even then, you're still gonna mess up, you're still gonna get a bad grade on a test, on a class, on a quiz, and that's fine. You just really gotta give yourself grace. And just at the end of the day, you gotta just do the best that you can. And, especially when you're studying, I've found negative self-labels don't help. Shocking. Yeah, calling yourself, oh, I'm just dumb, or oh, I'm just not good at math. That's really not helpful. And really, I think just the takeaway is just be patient with yourself, do the best you can, and, follow these strategy strategy tips. And yeah, okay, good luck, bye.